Hey everyone, it's Kenji. We're gonna make some meatballs. So we're gonna keep these real simple today, just the basics. Although that doesn't mean you have to keep your meatballs simple. So I'm gonna start my meatballs. I like to weigh my meat for it because it helps me season better when I'm adding salt. There's ways you can salt without weighing things, but I find it much easier to salt things by weight when you're working with raw meat like this. So let's see what we got. I'm gonna do about 250 grams each, so about a ½ pound each of ground pork and ground beef here. Let's get about 500 grams total. That's a nice easy number to season. I'll save the rest of that ground pork for something else. Start making the rest of my mixture here. So I've got some breadcrumbs. These are panko. If I had like a stale heel of, a baguette or something like that, I would use that instead. And what I would do is I would take that stale bread, soak it in water until it gets soft, and then take it, squeeze it out as much as possible, discard the water, and then go on from there. So to those breadcrumbs, I'm going to add an egg. So the idea here is that we're making what's called a panade. So essentially bread that's soaked in dairy. I'm using buttermilk. You can use whole milk. You can use heavy cream. You can use water if you want. But generally, dairy works, and I like the sort of tanginess that half and half brings. So I'm adding about a ½ cup, maybe a little bit less, of half and half. Egg here. So I'm going to take the flavors that I'm going to use in here. Very simple. Parsley, Parmesan cheese, and garlic. And that's it. Okay. Oops. You can of course use whatever other flavors you want. If you want to use like, chopped basil in there, that would be great. You could use some dry oregano in there. You could buy like a pack of Italian seasoning from dried Italian spices from McCormick or whatever and stick it in there. That'd be fine. Instead of beef and pork, you could use something like beef and a pre-made Italian sausage mix, although that will alter the texture of your meatballs. All right, so the idea behind the beef and the pork, by the way, is that something like beef is going to add a lot of flavor to it. So you could use beef, you could use something like beef or lamb would be great in a meatball. It's going to add a lot of flavor to it. If you try to make an all beef meatball, they come out a little bit sort of tough because beef is relatively hearty, dense meat. And so oftentimes meatballs and things like meatloaf will be cut with other meats. So pork, which will bring tenderness and a nice bit of fattiness to it, would be the other main choice. And then oftentimes you'll also see veal. So a classic meatloaf mix would be equal parts beef for flavor, pork for fattiness and texture, and then veal because it adds gelatin. So veal is very high in gelatin, collagen, connective tissue that hasn't yet sort of hardened into, the big muscles that adult steers have. So veal meat tends to be very high in collagen. And what that does is that as the meatball cooks, that collagen converts to gelatin. That gelatin can then sort of thicken up and help trap in juices. And so adding veal to meatloaf will really make it much more juicy, help it retain its juices a lot more. So one thing you can do in place of veal, you can of course use veal if you want. I usually don't really have access to it. So if I'm doing just beef and pork like this, I'll take some powdered gelatin. This is just unflavored powdered gelatin. And add about a tablespoon or so of this. And what this will do is that it'll hydrate in this panade mixture. And we're flavoring the panade. You don't have to, but I'm flavoring the panade and then adding the meat to it. But the gelatin will hydrate in this panade mixture, and then as the meatballs cook, they're going to behave. That gelatin is going to behave a lot in the way that adding veal would to a meatball. So you don't have to do that by any means. It's definitely not like a classic technique, but it is something that I like to do. I keep this powdered gelatin around for a bunch of different things. I add it to store-bought stock in order to give that stock more body, so you can reduce it into like a pan sauce more effectively, and it behaves more like a real homemade stock that way. I like to add it, of course, to meatballs and to meatloaf. I'll add it sometimes to the filling that I'm making for dumplings. So anytime where you want to sort of add a little bit of richness and body to a dish without altering its flavor, gelatin is a great way to do it, especially if you're working sort of with ground meat. I add some, like when I'm making a ragu bolognese, something like that, I'll add gelatin to it to give it a bit more richness. All right, so a couple garlic cloves, a bunch of parsley. I'm gonna grate a whole ton of Parmesan in here. You know, you don't have to use fresh garlic like I did. You can use garlic powder if you want. You know, I love to sometimes put pine nuts in my meatballs. Raisins, I know like people stick raisins in, why is it so hard to grate this cheese? I know people like scoff at sticking raisins in places where they don't belong, you know. I would never put raisins, say, in my coleslaw. It's like, I don't know, as they do sometimes. I do put raisins in my Japanese curry. Sometimes I put raisins in my meatballs. I think it's really delicious. Or currants in your little dried currants in your meatballs. That's delicious. You could take like some store-bought pesto and put them in here. Oh, you know what's really good is like forgo all of the sort of Italian flavors, period. You can, and instead of using a panade, use like some overcooked rice, okay, and add some of that overcooked rice to a mixture of ground pork and green curry paste, like a Thai curry paste, and that is delicious. All right, anyway, so I'm gonna now mix up my panade mixture. What I want to do is I really want to hydrate those breadcrumbs until it almost becomes like a paste, right? And the idea here is partly that, you know, it extends the meat, so you get more meals out of the same amount of meat. But really, it is about enhancing the texture of the meat. So meat, you know, similar to the way, say, gluten in bread dough works, the more you knead meat together, there's proteins in there that will start to link with each other. And so the more you knead it together, like I'm doing here, the more tightly those proteins are going to bind. And instead of being sort of a tender meatball texture, you're going to end up with something with a more sort of springy sausage-like texture if you were to just use meat and salt seasonings. And so that's why you add breadcrumbs to it, because what it does is that, you know, that this panade mixture will sort of physically interfere with the linking of those proteins. Oh, sorry, I got to measure out my salt. So I'm going to go with 1% salt here to the weight of the meat of that 500 grams. So I'm going to add 5 grams of salt. Normally, you know, I aim for a finished weight of around, 1.5 to 2% salt in food typically. You know, that would be sort of 2% would be like what a restaurant seasons to, you know, very highly seasoned. 1.5, you know, 1 to 1.5 would be sort of what a normal home cook, I think, seasons to percentage wise. And so I'm looking for a finished percentage of around 1.5% in this meatball. And so we have to remember that the Parmesan is also quite salty. So 1% salt I'm adding, maybe there was a touch more, plus whatever salt comes from the Parmesan. And that's going to be it for our mixture. Now with meatballs, when you're going to cook them, there's a number of ways you can do it. You know, the classic way, which is what I'm going to do now, is to fry them. There's a big chunk of Parmesan there. Is to fry them in a skillet. You can also, of course, though, bake them or do them in like an air fryer, a convection oven, something like that. So if I was going to bake my meatballs, roast them, I would make relatively big balls. Something like this, you know, something that can really brown before it overcooks and cooks all the way through. But since I'm doing it in a skillet, I'm going to make smaller balls here. Give my hands a rinse. I am going to get my hands meaty, of course, in a second, so I'm not really worried about getting them super clean. But I do want to start. I don't want my hands to have that sort of film of meat mixture on them before I begin here, because that is what's going to make the meatballs stick. Instead, I'm going to keep a little bowl of water to keep my hands damp while I work. All right. This right now is just a light olive oil, but you know, sort of any decent frying oil will do. Rice bran, canola, whatever you want to do. Regular olive oil, of course, would also work just fine. All right, so I'm gonna get my hands just a tiny bit damp so the meatloaf mixture doesn't stick, meatball mixture. All right, and I'm gonna make balls about that size. And I've got like maybe like 1/8 of an inch of oil down there. And you'll see as I fill up the pan, of course, the oil's gonna rise up the sides of the balls. So by the time I think all the balls are in, they will be submerged by at least, you know, 1/4, maybe 1/3 of an inch, if not more. And so that's gonna help them sort of cook evenly on both sides. All right, I will speed up this process so that you don't have to watch me, you know, slowly handle my balls. I'll speed it up for you, all right? So if you ever feel like it's starting to stick, quick rinse of water, and you should have a non-stick surface again on your hands. This skillet, I have it right now over relatively high heat, like sort of medium-high heat, and the skillet was preheating. So you want your skillet to be nice and hot before the meat mixture goes in, otherwise it'll, you know, it could tend to stick to the bottom or fall apart if you're not careful. I'm using this carbon steel skillet. You don't have to use carbon steel. Virtually anything will work for this. You know, cast iron, an enamel cast iron Dutch oven would work. You know, a multi-clad stainless skillet would work, although that would tend to stick a little bit more, so you have to be a little bit more careful managing your temperatures and stuff. Even a non-stick skillet would be fine for this. So really, you know, simple. Any kind of pan you want to use will work. All right, I will speed it up again for you. All right, so at this point, my balls are in the pan. And you saw I went around in a spiral like that. So now I'm gonna go back to the first one and check on it. And it looks like we are nice and brown. Look at that. So some people want to be very meticulous about browning all the edges and stuff. I don't really care about that. I'm gonna brown the top side and the bottom side, and then it's gonna go into the sauce. You know, I find you're browning mainly for flavor. You know, you get a little bit of a crust, but if you end up browning the whole thing, I find it gets a little bit too crusty for my taste, at least. These are looking really nice, though. So the sauce, by the way, the other day I was a couple weeks ago I met my friend Steven, the food freak, you know, from Not Another Cooking Show. I'll link to his channel. It's a great channel. You should watch it. But he was here in Seattle with a bunch of other, you know, food creator types for like a conference here, and I stopped by to say hello. And Steven had, you know, lovingly cut up, simmered, and then passed through a food mill. You know, a bunch of fresh plum tomatoes, cherry tomatoes. He was making a beautiful sauce for this handmade orecchiette, which he actually taught me how to do. I'd never made orecchiette in my life before that a few weeks ago. So anyhow, yeah, that was his sauce. My sauce is a jar of Rayo's that I bought from Costco. But I did go into the garden and got a little sprig of basil to simmer in there with it. You know, because that way, when I started the video, when we got to the sauce section, I could have gone either way. You know, I could have told you all that it was fresh tomatoes done the Steven food freak way. But I decided to be honest at the end. I'm always honest. All right, so the meatballs are just about done. We're just trying to get some color on them again, remember? And then they're gonna go straight into this sauce here. Yeah. All right, those are definitely ready to go. We're gonna go straight in the sauce. And then, you know, you can, you know, simmer meatballs all day if you really feel like it. I don't think there's anything to be gained from doing that, though, to be honest. I think meatballs are best. And I feel the same way often about meatloaf. Maybe not quite as strongly about meatloaf, but I feel that meatballs are best eaten freshly cooked and not overcooked. You know, cooked to 165, maybe 155. But I feel that there's not really much to be gained from, like, you know, braising a meatball, other than sort of accidentally drying it out. There is, you know, a little bit of sort of flavor exchange that happens, of course, between the meat and the sauce. So maybe there's, you know, that argument to be had. But, you know, that's what leftovers are for. All right, so now I'm just gonna let these simmer off for just a few moments so that they're cooked through. And that wonderful Rayo's. Not an ad. All right, down to a simmer. We will, of course, be serving these the classic way with spaghetti on the first day. And on the second day, I will be making them into a meatball sub, which is the second most classic way. Outside of Italy, of course. In Italy, you know, meatballs are not eaten served on top of spaghetti, and they are not these large monstrosities that you see here. They're reasonable size to be eaten by reasonable people. Okay. But that is not us. So I'm just going to grab a tiny bit more parsley for a garnish here. Let's see. A couple little sprigs. Very good. Be a little chopperoo. All right, let me find a nice plate to put some. Nice plate to rest my balls on. Here we go. All right. I'm gonna scoop up maybe 3 of these fellows for me. What do you think? Little saucy, the sauciness. Oh, I wish I had some bread to go with this, but I don't. I would like some bread to dip up. Bread for dippage. Oh man, look at this. Ooh, sorry, fridge. A little bit of olive oil. Alrighty. Alright, let's try a bite. Mmm. Tender, flavorful, delicious. All right, I'm afraid my camera ran out of battery, so you didn't get to hear me ooh and ah over the meatballs I was eating before. So I will now repeat my oohing and ahhing. Okay, it went something like this. I took a bite. Ooh, ah. And then I said something really eloquent about how these are the kind of meatballs that are sort of like, you know, really ethereally light, that kind of melt in your mouth. And it's just, it's very simple, right? It's all just that panade. In action. And of course, you can do, you know, the flavors you saw today, super simple. You can go way more elaborate if you want, but you really don't need to. Sometimes simple is great. Ooh, all right, guys, gals, non-binary pals. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.